The wind swept through Camp Trinity's parade ground with a kind of dry sharpness that cut into skin like paper. It was inspection day, the kind that made even the most seasoned soldiers tighten their posture and polish their boots twice. A line of green uniforms stretched in rigid formation under the pale Wyoming sky breath, turning to mist boots planted firm on frostbitten concrete. At the end of the third row, Private Cole Whitman leaned slightly out of formation, his voice low and oily. "You see that scar on her arm?" he muttered to the recruit beside him, nodding toward the woman adjusting a supply crate across the lot. "Pretty sure she got that losing a fight with a coffee machine." Snickers bubbled from the nearby rookies. A few eyes darted nervously toward the subject of the joke. A woman maybe in her mid-30s with tightly coiled hair, pulled back beneath her maintenance cap and sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her name tag read, Morgan A. She said little, walked alone, never raised her voice. But to Cole, she was a puzzle that begged to be picked apart, a black woman in a support role, quiet, scarred, and utterly unimpressive. The perfect target. Seriously, though, Cole went on, voice smug affirmative action, must be working overtime. Who puts someone like that in uniform? The others chuckled, though more hesitantly now. One of them, a lanky kid with a new buzz cut, avoided her gaze and shifted on his feet. Another, Corporal Elijah Brooks, said nothing, but glanced at Cole with a tight jaw. He'd heard jokes like these before, jokes that sounded like schoolyard nonsense, but came wrapped in something uglier. Something that didn't belong in a uniform. Captain Aaliyah Morgan, for her part, heard every word. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Cole Whitman. His voice carried with the same reckless confidence, every time the kind only possessed by boys who'd never had to bleed for the right to speak. She continued her task, sliding a wrench back into its slot, adjusting the panel on a vehicle with a precision that could only come from years of practice. She didn't flinch, didn't react, but her eyes, steady, observant, swept the field like sonar. At 24, Cole had never been deployed. He'd never tasted sand in his teeth in Kandahar, never heard the whistle of bullets in a jungle night. He was the son of a retired general, used to shortcuts, used to doors opening before he knocked. Camp Trinity was just a stepping stone to him, a stopover before some plush overseas stationing arranged by his father's old friends. And then there was Aaliyah. No one knew much about her. She'd arrived quietly 2 months earlier with a reassignment letter and a history that looked suspiciously thin. She worked as a maintenance officer, fixed engines, calibrated weapon systems, rarely spoke. But even in silence, there was something off, something that didn't add up. She never stood with her back to a door. She never reached for anything without scanning the room first. Her eyes didn't wander, they assessed. Every movement, every breath was intentional, economical, like a shadow that had learned to walk in daylight without being noticed. Cole didn't notice. He wasn't trained to. She probably hasn't seen combat in her life. He scoffed during break the previous day. Maintenance people just ride desks and change oil. But Sergeant Major Tobias Grant had noticed. He'd seen the way she field-stripped an M4 rifle with her eyes closed in 17 seconds flat. He'd seen the faint hesitation in her step whenever someone shouted behind her, like a reflex honed under fire. He'd seen it before in Iraq and Somalia, in places the rest of the base only whispered about. And that morning, as Cole whispered poison behind his smirk, Grant simply narrowed his eyes and made a quiet note in the small black book he always carried. The wind picked up again. From across the field, Captain Morgan stood and wiped her hands. She straightened, ran a cloth once across her name tag, and turned toward the rows of recruits. Her eyes caught Cole's for a second. Just a second. No smile, no warning. Just a stare, calm, deliberate, and so steady that it made his breath catch. Not fear, not anger, just stillness. It was the kind of look a predator gives when it's already chosen the time and place. Cole laughed it off, what he said, voice cracking slightly. She's gonna cry. But inside, something unfamiliar stirred in his gut. A flicker, a whisper, not guilt, not yet, but doubt. And far behind him, General Catherine Reed was checking an encrypted message on her tablet. A message that simply read, inspection at 0830. She's ready. G. She looked up at the overcast sky and muttered to herself, time to remind them what shadows are made of. Cole didn't sleep well that night. Maybe it was the cold wind rattling the barracks windows, or maybe it was the way Captain Morgan's eyes had locked with his, not accusing, Not even angry. Just quiet, unshaken. The kind of look that didn't argue because it had nothing to prove. Still by morning, he was back to his usual swagger. The base's weekly hand-to-hand training was scheduled his favorite. He saw it as a chance to remind everyone he wasn't just a mouthpiece with a name, he could throw down too. When Sergeant Davison asked for volunteers to pair up, Cole didn't hesitate. "I'll take the maintenance lady," he called out with a grin. Time she learned the difference between a wrench and a wrist lock. The room went uncomfortably silent. A few recruits looked away. Sergeant Major Grant, arms folded at the edge of the mat, didn't say a word, just observed. Captain Morgan stepped forward without a flicker of expression. "No padding?" Cole asked, mock concern gesturing to her arms. "Wouldn't want to add more scars." She said nothing, just nodded once at Davison, who gave the go-ahead. Cole came at her fast. Sloppy, overconfident. He aimed a classic grab-and-pull something they taught first-week recruits. She didn't even counter, she shifted. Subtle like water moving around a stone. The next second, he was off balance. The next, he was on the floor. Hard. She hadn't slammed him, hadn't used strength. She'd redirected his own momentum and let gravity finish the job. There was a collective intake of breath. Cole scrambled up, red-faced. Beginner's luck. Round 2. This time he lunged with more speed, more force. She caught his arm mid-strike, turned her body just enough to torque his shoulder, and dropped him again with surgical precision. This time he hit the mat gasping. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just reached out a hand to help him up. "Nice setup," she said calmly, like a teacher correcting a student. "But you telegraphed it with your left shoulder. In real combat, that would have been fatal." He ignored her hand and pushed himself up, jaw clenched. The room was silent except for the distant sound of weights clanging in the adjacent gym. Captain Morgan simply stepped back, rolled her shoulders once, and moved to the edge of the mat. For the rest of the session, she didn't say another word. She didn't need to. But Cole, something in him had cracked. He covered it quickly, cracked jokes about her being street-trained, mumbled excuses to anyone who'd listen about cheap tricks and lucky moves. But the truth was heavy, unsettling. It pressed against him in the silence of his bunk that night and stayed there. From that day on, the laughter around him thinned. Recruits stopped playing along. Some wouldn't meet his eyes. Others just moved away when he spoke. But Cole couldn't see it clearly, yet he was too deep in his pride to recognize what was unraveling. He didn't know that Corporal Brooks had already forwarded screenshots of his private messages to Sergeant Major Grant. He didn't know Grant had quietly flagged his behavior for higher review. He didn't know that behind the stillness in Morgan's gaze was a meticulous memory, a mind that cataloged time, tone, witness, and intent like assembling pieces of a slow-burning fuse. And he certainly didn't know that an encrypted file on a secure Army network was already being updated, with his name time-stamped, annotated and prepared for someone far beyond his rank to review. Because while Cole Whitman thought he'd put a target on Captain Morgan, he had no idea he was the one being quietly, methodically, and unforgettably marked. Cole still believed he was winning. The whispers had died down, sure. The laughter wasn't as loud, but in his mind it meant people were intimidated, not disapproving. After all he'd embarrassed her on the mat didn't matter what it looked like. No one was calling her a badass. No one was huddling around her at lunch. She was still that same quiet maintenance officer with scars on her arms and a vacant chair beside her in the mess hall. Still invisible. Except she wasn't. Captain Morgan's invisibility was no accident. It was strategy. Every dismissive glance, every offhand comment, every shift in body language, she logged it. Quietly. Precisely. After lights out, while others scrolled their phones or drifted off to sleep, Aaliyah opened a military-issued laptop that technically didn't exist on any base inventory. Its screen glowed faintly in the darkness as her fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who had once typed field reports while bleeding out behind enemy lines. She documented everything. The time Cole had mocked her in front of 10 recruits by calling her Captain Affirmative Action. The way he bumped into her in the hallway and whispered, "Careful, wouldn't want another scratch." The smirks from his buddies. The moments they pretended not to hear. She didn't exaggerate, didn't editorialize, just facts, dates, times, names, words verbatim. And she wasn't alone. After the hand-to-hand incident, Corporal Brooks approached her during a late evening in the supply room. He didn't say her name, didn't even say hello. I served under someone, once he said, eyes scanning the shadows, in North Africa. She didn't speak much either, but she moved like you, watched like you. A pause. If you are who I think you are, well, some of us have been documenting Whitman's behavior. Just in case. Aaliyah looked at him. Not surprised, not grateful, just calm. Her voice was steady. I don't know what you're talking about, Corporal. He smiled faintly. Of course you don't. Word spread quietly, respectfully. A few veterans began keeping closer tabs on Cole. Not for Morgan's sake. She didn't need protecting. They did it for the principle, because they'd seen what unchecked arrogance could do in the field. They'd buried friends because someone underestimated the quiet one in the corner. Sergeant Major Grant began showing up coincidentally whenever Cole launched into one of his speeches. He never intervened. Just stood at the edge of the room, arms folded, watching, listening. Sometimes jotting something down. No one dared ask what. Meanwhile, Cole remained oblivious, or maybe willfully blind. He bragged in group chats about putting the lady in her place. Called her maintenance Barbie in a meme he sent to 3 other soldiers. Even posted a selfie flexing beside the Humvee she'd just repaired with the caption, "Thanks, Grease Monkey." Screenshots made their way to a growing folder on Grant's desk, and every night Aaliyah typed her report. No anger, no revenge in her heart, just clarity. She had learned long ago, back in countries no one ever talked about on TV, that the most effective strikes were the ones you never saw coming. She had no need to confront Cole. He was documenting his own downfall with every breath he didn't realize was being heard. It was a Thursday when the wind changed. The sky hung low over Camp Trinity that morning, thick with gray clouds and the smell of snow. The base was quiet, unusually so. Recruits lined up for inspection as usual, uniforms crisp, boots polished back straight, but there was a tension in the air, like a wire pulled too tight. Cole was in the middle of making another one of his trademark jabs, something about how Captain Morgan probably used crayons instead of tools, when a sharp voice echoed across the parade ground. Attention, General, on deck. Every soldier snapped to position. Even Cole, though he rolled his eyes first as if the arrival of a general was just another performance for the brass. But then he saw who stepped out of the black SUV. General Catherine Reed. The name alone pulled a hush through the ranks. She wasn't a desk-bound bureaucrat. Reed was a career warfighter, 3 tours, 2 medals of valor, and a stare that could drop temperatures 10 degrees. She was the kind of commander people didn't just follow, they trusted with their lives. Cole's smirk faltered as the general stepped onto the field, flanked by aides in silence. But what made his blood run cold wasn't her presence, it was what happened next. General Reed took 3 steps into formation, then stopped. Her gaze had locked on something or someone in the back row. And then, in full view of 200 stunned soldiers, she broke protocol. She saluted first. All eyes followed hers and landed on Captain Morgan, standing calm, steady in her usual place, grease still faint on her fingers. She didn't blink, didn't move, just returned the salute, slow and sure. A beat passed. Then General Reed's voice rang out at ease. I believe most of you know her as your maintenance officer. What you don't know is that you've spent the past 2 months in the presence of a war hero. The silence deepened. The words hung in the air like live electricity. She is not just Captain Morgan. She is Colonel Aaliyah Morgan. Call sign, Spectre. Decorated commander of Operation Iron Mirage. Tactical lead on 3 Black Ops missions the Pentagon still refuses to declassify. Murmurs rippled down the line. Some of the older soldiers glanced at each other, eyes wide, mouths slightly open as dots began connecting in their minds. A legend. She'd been here the whole time. Cole's knees felt loose. His breath caught in his throat. General Reed wasn't done. I've received a report over the last 72 hours, she said, holding up a thick manila folder, documenting repeated targeted harassment of Colonel Morgan. Racial slurs, derogatory language, abuse of rank, disrespect toward a superior officer. She flipped the folder open. Private Whitman, she said flatly, stepped forward. Cole didn't move. Now, his feet betrayed him, dragging forward like they weighed 100 pounds each. He stood in front of the general, pale and visibly shaking. You mocked a soldier who has seen more battlefield hours than your father has spent in a uniformed office. You diminished her scars earned while dragging wounded soldiers through mortar fire. You laughed at a woman who built her rank on blood and grit while you were still deciding which college to apply to. Cole opened his mouth to speak, but Reed cut him off. You didn't know, she said. That's what you're going to say, isn't it? He nodded faintly. And that she said, voice cold as Wyoming frost, is the problem. Cole stood frozen, the cold Wyoming air suddenly biting through his uniform in a way it never had before. General Reed's words didn't just land, they detonated. Each syllable peeled back his pride layer by layer in front of the entire base. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her voice was composed, deliberate, the kind of control that only came from years of command and from deep personal disappointment. You spent weeks humiliating a superior officer, she continued. Not just any officer, a decorated warfighter, a leader who once carried 2 injured Marines across 7 miles of enemy territory with shrapnel in her arms and no backup. Cole's eyes dropped to the ground, unable to look at her, unable to look at Captain Morgan, Colonel Morgan, now standing at attention behind him with quiet poise. And why, Reed asked, not expecting an answer. Because she didn't fit your picture of what strength looks like. Because she was quiet. Because she was black female. Because her scars made you uncomfortable. He swallowed hard. The weight of his ignorance pressed in like gravity. Your behavior isn't just offensive, she said. It's a tactical liability. Arrogance like yours gets people killed in the field. She turned to Corporal Brooks, who stepped forward and read from a page in the folder. Captain Band-Aid. Probably earned her rank fixing kitchen sinks. Maintenance monkey. Bet she's never seen combat. Every word felt like a nail in a coffin, and Cole knew it was his. There were no laughs now, no smirks from his friends, only silence and the sting of betrayal, isolation, shame. Private Whitman. Reed said, effective immediately, you are reassigned to Elmendorf Richardson Outpost in Alaska. You will serve there for no less than 2 years under direct disciplinary review. Your record will reflect this transfer, and this incident will remain a permanent note in your file. Gasps stirred in the formation. Alaska, the military's frozen purgatory. Everyone knew what it meant. Isolation, humbling, reputation shattered. And one more thing, Reed added, stepping closer, her voice low and cutting. Colonel Morgan could have ended your career the first week. She could have filed reports, pushed for charges. You know what she did instead? Cole didn't answer. She gave you time to reflect, to grow. She offered you silence, hoping you'd fill it with respect. You wasted it. He stood there, breathing shallow, trying to swallow the bitter taste rising in his throat. Then for the first time, Colonel Morgan spoke. General, she said calmly, I didn't report Private Whitman because I believe this was an opportunity not just for him, but for the entire unit. Sometimes the most dangerous threats to cohesion come not from outside our walls, but from the assumptions we carry within them. The words landed softer than Reed's, but they cut deeper, and not just for Cole. All across the field, soldiers shifted uncomfortably, reevaluating the jokes they had laughed at, the moments they had stayed silent. Reed gave a slow nod. Well said, Colonel. Cole was dismissed. He walked off the field in silence, past every person he had once tried to impress. None looked at him. Or worse, some did and shook their heads. And Aaliyah. She didn't smile, didn't blink, just turned, stepped back into formation, and stood tall, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as exactly what she had always been, a soldier who knew when to fight and when to wait. 6 months passed, but the echo of that day never really left Camp Trinity. The parade ground where Cole Whitman had once smirked so easily was now a place of quiet reverence. New recruits arrived already knowing the story about the private who mocked the wrong woman and the officer who turned humiliation into a masterclass in leadership. They whispered her call sign like a legend passed between generations specter. But Colonel Aaliyah Morgan didn't lean into the myth. She didn't hang her medals on the walls of her new office, which overlooked the training field. Instead, she decorated it with something else: photos of her unit, handwritten letters from families of soldiers she'd once protected, thank you notes from young women who'd chosen the military after hearing her speak. She rarely spoke about Alaska. Not directly. But everyone knew Cole had been sent there. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but that wasn't the hardest part. The real cold came from the looks, the silence, the respect he hadn't earned. Up there, stories travel fast. Every soldier knew why he was there. On his first day, a grizzled sergeant with frostbitten knuckles looked him over and said, "So you're the one who mocked the specter? Jesus, kid, you have no idea." Cole kept his head down. He didn't talk back. Not anymore. Back in Wyoming, Camp Trinity had become a destination of choice, not for its prestige, but for what it now stood for. Recruits requested transfers because they wanted to train under her, because they believed there was something rare in a leader who didn't command by shouting, but by watching, who didn't retaliate, but instead transformed. Aaliyah began teaching a mandatory leadership seminar every Friday. It wasn't about tactics or combat drills. It was about what she called invisible fire, the kind of strength that doesn't seek validation, but burns steady beneath the surface. Arrogance, she would tell them, is the most lethal blind spot a soldier can have. It makes you deaf to advice, blind to skill, and eventually, dead. No one interrupted her when she spoke. Corporal Brooks had since been promoted and now assisted her directly in training. Sergeant Major Grant had been recognized by command for his discretionary vigilance and quietly recommended for senior leadership. The team that once observed in silence now led by example. Then one rainy Thursday, an envelope arrived on Aaliyah's desk. No return address, just a single sheet of paper inside a letter. The handwriting was careful, like someone trying to get each word right. "Colonel Morgan, I don't know if I deserve your time, but I need to try anyway. I've spent the last 2 years learning what it really means to wear this uniform, not from training manuals, not from ranks, but from reflection, from shame. I mocked something I didn't understand, and I destroyed a future I thought was mine by right. I see that now. You gave me a chance I didn't earn. You didn't destroy me. You didn't need to. You let the truth do it. If I ever earn a second chance, I'll wear it differently this time. Not because I want redemption, but because I finally know what it means to serve. CW." She read it once, then folded it, placed it carefully in the top drawer of her desk, and went back to reviewing mission schedules. Later that afternoon during her seminar, a recruit raised his hand and asked, "Ma'am, what's the best way to respond when someone underestimates you?" Aaliyah paused. Then without looking up, she said, "Build something so solid, so meaningful, that their judgment becomes irrelevant." The rain hadn't let up that weekend. From the large windows of her office, Colonel Aaliyah Morgan watched as a new unit of recruits jogged through the mud boots, kicking up earth shouts blending with the rumble of thunder. She didn't mind the weather. Some things, she believed, should begin under pressure. It told you who was paying attention, who knew how to keep moving when things got uncomfortable. She sipped her coffee slowly, her hand resting on the drawer that now held Cole Whitman's letter. She hadn't answered it. She wasn't sure she needed to. The words had said enough. Not for closure, she didn't need that, but as proof that even arrogance could be reshaped if pressed hard enough by the weight of truth. Her story had spread far beyond Camp Trinity. Cadets at West Point studied a case titled "Spectre Leadership in Silence." ROTC programs across the country dissected her choices. Business schools quoted her on restraint. Civilian leaders requested her at panels they once would have reserved for polished generals in dress blues. But Aaliyah didn't seek stages. She didn't like the spotlight. What mattered most to her happened quietly, the way young women in uniform started standing straighter when they walked into the hangar. The way platoon leaders began noticing the quiet ones before the loud ones. The way recruits asked fewer questions about how fast they could rise and more about how to earn it. One afternoon during her final lecture of the quarter, a recruit named Jensen asked, "Ma'am, do you think justice really works in the military?" The room fell silent. Aaliyah looked up from her notes. "I don't think justice is a system," she said. "It's a pattern, one that repeats when people choose to see, when people speak up, or stay silent strategically. Sometimes justice doesn't look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like someone finally understanding who they are and who they hurt." She paused, then added almost softly, "Sometimes justice is knowing when to wait and when to step forward." No one said a word, but everyone felt it. Outside the classroom, the base had changed. The culture had shifted. Camp Trinity was no longer just a remote outpost. It had become something more, a place where leadership was measured not by volume, but by depth, where the scars someone wore didn't invite pity or ridicule, but respect. End Cole. No one really knew where he was now. Some said he'd requested transfer back to the mainland. Others whispered he'd started mentoring recruits quietly somewhere up north, far from headlines, far from ego. No one had seen him, but Aaliyah had. Once, briefly, from across a crowded conference hall during a leadership summit in D.C. He didn't approach, just nodded. She returned it. That was enough. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come as a grand gesture. It comes in the form of two people who know exactly what was broken and who've both chosen to move forward carrying different weight now. The scars on Aaliyah's arms never faded. They weren't supposed to. They were reminders not of pain, but of what she had endured and what she had refused to become. And for the soldiers who trained under her, they became something else entirely, a symbol that real strength isn't loud, doesn't boast, and never needs to prove itself. Late that night, Aaliyah wrote in her personal journal, not the reports, not the official logs, just the one she kept for herself. The best revenge isn't to crush the ones who tried to break you. It's to build something so steady, so true, that the cracks they tried to make become the very lines that hold you together. She closed the book, turned off the light. Outside, the storm had passed, but the ground was still soaked, ready perhaps for something new to grow. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, consider leaving a comment or subscribing to the channel. Sometimes the quietest strength leaves the loudest echo.